My parents ignored me for a decade after the divorce, then reunited overnight to sue me over my inheritance, finishing each other's sentences in court like no time had passed, until their own lawyer pulled out a stack of records neither of them knew I'd kept. They came in holding hands. That's what I could not stop looking at on the 3rd of March. Not the suit my father was wearing, which was new, and not my mother's hair, which was done. Their hands. Right up the center aisle of a courtroom in Sedalia, Missouri, my father's hand around my mother's, the way you'd walk into a wedding. They had not been photographed in the same room since 2015. They sat down at the petitioner's table, and my mother leaned over and said something, and my father laughed. Quietly, appropriately, a courtroom laugh. And then he put his hand on the back of her chair. 11 years since the divorce. 11 years in which the two of them had not been in a room together, and in which my father's own mother had died, and I had told him by text message because I did not have a current phone number that he answered. And here they were, 4 feet apart, finishing each other's sentences about my grandmother's kitchen. The judge smiled at them. I want that recorded. A judge in Pettis County smiled at my parents on the 3rd of March because they were charming, and I sat 8 feet away and understood that I was going to lose. 7 weeks later, they were put in separate rooms on consecutive days, and it took about 90 minutes for the whole thing to come apart, and neither of them ever saw it coming. And the reason is a shoebox my grandmother handed me in 2019 and told me to keep somewhere my aunt wouldn't throw it out. My name is Andrea Pardue. I'm 31, and I do surgical scheduling for a hospital in Sedalia. What that means practically is that I run a board. 9 operating rooms, 40-some surgeons, and a whole day of blocks that has to fit together. And when a case runs long or a surgeon calls out or somebody needs an add-on at 2 in the afternoon, I'm the one who rebuilds the afternoon in about 6 minutes. I'm good at it. I like the specific kind of pressure. There's no ambiguity in an OR board. Either the day fits or it doesn't. And when it doesn't, you find out inside an hour. I live in a 1-bedroom over a dentist's office on Ohio Street with a window unit and a cat. I've been there 6 years. I don't have a lot of what people my age have. I have never been married, and I've got a car with $140,000 on it and about $11,000 in a retirement account. And until July of 2024, that was the entire financial fact of my life. My grandmother, Opal Pardue, was born in 1938 and died in July of 2024 at 86, at home, in the farmhouse she'd lived in since 1961. She was on dialysis for the last 3 years of her life, 3 times a week to start, then twice, Tuesdays and Fridays, at a clinic on Broadway. I drove her every Tuesday and every Friday from March of 2021 to the week she died. 290-some round trips, 22 minutes each way, and I moved my shift to a 5:30 start to do it. And my supervisor let me because she is a decent person. You learn somebody in a car. That's the whole thing nobody tells you about caregiving. It isn't noble, it's a Tuesday, and it's the same 22 minutes of road. And after about the 40th one, you have said everything there is to say, and then you start actually talking. She told me about the winter of 1978 in that car. She told me about a man she'd nearly married in 1959. She told me once in 2022 with her eyes closed that she had made a mistake with my father and that she had known it by the time he was about 9 and had never worked out what to do about it. I said, "What kind of mistake?" And she said, "The kind where you keep giving somebody the benefit of the doubt because you're his mother." That's the closest she ever came to explaining anything to me directly. Everything else she did was in a shoebox. 600 Tuesdays is a number, and the number is not the thing, so take one. The 11th of January, 2022. Ice on the road out to her place, and I got there at 5:50 and had to go in and get her because she wasn't at the door, and she was sitting on the edge of the bed with one shoe on. Dialysis morning, she was always cold. The clinic runs cold, and the treatment makes you colder. So she'd wear 2 cardigans and take a blanket, and I'd run the heat in that car until I was sweating through my scrubs, and she'd still say it was drafty. 4 hours in the chair. I'd drop her and go do a shift and come back at 11, and she'd come out through the double doors moving like somebody 20 years older than she'd been when she went in, because that's what it takes out of you. That day her blood pressure crashed at the end of the run, and they held her an extra 40 minutes, and when she finally came out she was gray, and she did not want to talk, and I got her in the car, and we drove 11 miles without either of us saying anything. And then, coming up on the turn, she said, "Andrea." I said, "Ma'am," and she said, "Don't let this be your whole thing." I said something like, "It's 2 days a week," and she said, "That's not what I said." That's what those 3 years were. Not devotion. 2 people in a Chevrolet with the heat on high, one of them tired past talking, twice a week for 150 weeks. In February of 2026, a man in Warrensburg who has never met me wrote that down in a numbered paragraph and called it "Isolating the Decedent from Other Family Members." I went to live with my Aunt Estelle in 2006 when I was 11. It was supposed to be for a few weeks. My parents were separating. The first time, the 2006 one, not the one that stuck. And I was going to stay at Estelle's until things settled. Things did not settle, and then they did. And by then I had a room at Estelle's with my own dresser in it, and nobody ever came and got me, and there was no conversation about it at any point. That's how it happened. Not a decision. An accumulation of Sundays. I spent about 90% of my nights from 11 to 19 at my aunt's house on Sneed Street. My parents lived 4 miles away, and I saw them, and there were dinners and Christmases, and I was not abandoned in the way that word gets used. I was just not the thing either of them was doing. They divorced properly in March of 2015. I was 19. I was not asked about it, and I did not learn learn about it until it was final. And I found out because Estelle told me at her kitchen table with a dish towel in her hands. After that, it went quiet fast. My father moved to Warrensburg and then to somewhere near Clinton. My mother moved to Springfield with a man named Coburn and then somewhere else. There was no falling out. Nobody said anything terrible to anybody. It just thinned. A call every couple of months, then every 6, then a birthday text, then a birthday text some years. I have gone back and counted because a lawyer eventually asked me to. Between March of 2015 and July of 2024, 9 years and 4 months, I saw my father in person 11 times and my mother 9. Every single one of those was at a funeral, a hospital, or somebody else's event. Neither of them ever came to Sedalia to see me. Not once in 9 years. Estelle Pardue is 61 and worked 29 years at a plant that makes electrical connectors and retired in 2023 with a bad back and a small pension. She is my father's sister. She never married and never had children, and I have never once heard her describe taking me in as anything, because in her account nothing happened. A kid needed a room and she had a room. She keeps everything. That is the single most important fact in this entire story. She has every card anybody has ever sent her. She has the receipt from the connector plant's Christmas party in 1997. When she retired, they gave her a clock and she kept the box the clock came in. I used to think it was clutter. It is not clutter. It is a person who grew up poor in Pettis County in the 70s, understanding at a level below language that paper is the only thing that argues back. She taught me it without ever teaching me anything. And in April of 2016, my grandmother, who was Estelle's mother, did the same thing on a much larger scale and told nobody. The trust was drafted in April of 2016, and I did not know it existed until my grandmother was dead. She never mentioned it. 8 years, 600 trips to a dialysis clinic, and Opal Pardue never once said the words, "I've left you the place." I've thought about why. I think it's 2 things. I think she did not want to be thanked, which was a real and slightly severe thing about her. And I think she did not want me driving her to dialysis for 8 years while knowing. She wanted to be able to believe I was doing it for nothing. And I was. And now I can't prove it to anybody, including myself. And I have decided that is her last and best joke on me. The certified letters started in 2016, and they were Estelle's idea, and they were not sentimental. I'd been sending cards. Birthday, Christmas, the occasional "what are you up to?" And around 2016, my mother started saying she hadn't received things. Estelle heard me say that on the phone once and said, "Send it certified." I said that was ridiculous. She said, "It's $4 and you'll know." So I did. From October of 2016 to July of 2024, I sent 61 certified letters and cards between the 2 of them. $4 and change apiece. About $250 over 8 years, which I could not really afford and spent anyway. 19 came back unclaimed. 42 were signed for. At the time, I thought I was being petty. I genuinely did. There is something small about certifying a birthday card to your own mother, and I felt small doing it every single time, standing at the counter of the post office on Ohio Street. Estelle was not being petty. Estelle was building an exhibit, and neither of us knew it for 8 years. Opal died on the 19th of July, 2024 in the front bedroom at about 4 in the afternoon. I was there. Estelle was there. A hospice nurse named Farrell had been there that morning. The funeral was on the 24th at the Methodist Church on Osage, and there were about 90 people at it, which is a lot for an 86-year-old woman who had outlived most of her generation. I did the flowers and the program and the food, and Estelle did the phone calls, and the 2 of us split her closet in an afternoon because neither of us could face doing it alone. My father came. He got there 11 minutes before it started, and he was pleasant to everybody, and he stood at the front with Estelle in the receiving line and shook probably 60 hands. He was good at it. He has always been good at it. He is a genuinely likable man, and that is not a small part of how any of this happened. He said 4 sentences to me. I have them. At the front, "Hey, this is a hard one." At the graveside, "You did all right by her." In the fellowship hall, with a paper cup of coffee, Estelle got the flowers, and at the door, with his keys already out, "I've got a thing in Clinton, 12 minutes into the meal." 90 people eating ham and my father in the parking lot at 1:40. I stood at the fellowship hall window and watched him back out, and I did not feel anything about it, which I mention because 18 months later, a man would stand in a courtroom and describe my father as a grieving son who had been kept from his mother's final years. My mother did not come. She sent flowers with a card that said, "With sympathy," and a name. Neither of them asked about the house. Not once. Not that week. Not at the funeral. Not in the 4 months after. I want that noted because it is the thing that made the following February so completely disorienting. The trust was administered in September, and the meeting was in an office on 6th Street on a Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. There were 3 people in the room, me, Estelle, and the successor trustee, a woman named Ballard from a bank. That's it. 3 people, and one of them was there because I'd asked her to drive me. Ms. Ballard went through it the way you would go through a lease renewal. The farmhouse and the 22 acres on Bothwell Road, appraised at $291,000. A brokerage account with $121,000 in it. $412,000. Sole beneficiary, Andrea Lynn Pardue. I did not understand what I was being told for about 4 minutes. I kept waiting for a second part. I actually said at one point, "And who else?" And Ms. Ballard looked at her page and said, "There's no one else, ma'am." And Estelle, sitting beside me, said one word, which was "mama," and put her hand over her mouth, because that is the part that should have told me everything and did not. My aunt, who took an 11-year-old and kept her for 8 years on a plant wage, who is Opal's own daughter, got nothing. I asked Ms. Ballard about it in the parking lot. I said there had to be something for Estelle, and she said, the document is the document. And Estelle said in the passenger seat on the way home, not looking at me, she knew I'd give it to you anyway, save everybody the postage. I laughed. I actually laughed in September of 2024 at a joke. I did not understand until March of 2026 that my grandmother had put every single asset she owned into one person's hands on purpose, because an estate split 4 ways in Pettis County is an estate with 4 opportunities in it, and an estate that goes to one person who drove her to dialysis is a document that only has one line to attack. She wasn't being unfair to her daughter, she was reducing the surface area. She had been thinking about this since April of 2016, and she never said one word to either of us. 18 months of nothing. The neighbor Sutter has farmed those 22 acres on a handshake since 2011, and I put it in writing and he pays me in November. The farmhouse sat empty and I drove out every couple of weeks to run the water. I did not quit my job. I did not buy a car. The brokerage account sat exactly where it was because I did not know what to do with it and was frightened of it. I told about 4 people. That's it. In 18 months. Estelle, my supervisor, and 2 friends. I have gone back over that period about 100 times looking for how they found out, and the honest answer is probably the assessor's records, which are public, and somebody in this county who talks. That's all it takes. My father has a cousin who knows everybody's business as a kind of vocation. I was served on the 9th of February, 2026, at 4:40 in the afternoon, in the parking lot at work. A polite man in a Nissan who said sorry about this and meant it, which I have since learned is what all of them say. I read it at my kitchen table at about 6 with the cat on the chair opposite. Petition to set aside trust. Undue influence. Petitioners, Lonnie Pardue and Verlene Pardue, both names, together, on one document, filed by one attorney. I sat there and read that caption maybe 9 times before I got to any of the actual allegations, because I could not get past the fact that my parents' names were next to each other on a piece of paper for the first time since 2015. The allegations were that I had isolated my grandmother, that I had controlled her contacts, that I had positioned myself as her sole caregiver in order to procure the instrument, and there were dates, specific ones, in a numbered paragraph. On or about March 4th, 2021, respondent began transporting decedent to and from appointments, thereby limiting decedent's contact with other family members. March 4th, 2021 is the first Tuesday I drove her. They had my dialysis schedule, and they had turned it into a paragraph about isolation. What that does is hard to name. It is not anger at first. It's a kind of nausea. Somebody has taken the single best thing you ever did, the thing you rearranged your life around, 600 round trips, 22 minutes each way, 3 years, and rewritten it as a method. I sat at that table for about 2 hours and did not eat anything, and then I called Estelle and cried on the phone for the first time since I was a teenager. My attorney's name is Yancey, and he has been doing probate and trust work in Pettis County for 26 years, and he told me 2 things on the 12th of February that I did not want to hear. The first was that this was not a nuisance filing. It was thin, but it was real, and undue influence cases turn on facts that look exactly like my life: a caregiver, an isolated elderly person, a change in an estate plan, and a beneficiary who benefits. On paper, he said, you are the fact pattern. The second thing was about settling. I asked. Of course I asked. I sat there and did the math and thought, give them $50,000 each and make it stop. And Yancey put his pen down and said, you can. And then you've bought a document that says you paid them. And every person in this county who ever wonders about it will know you paid them. And when they need money again in 4 years, you're the person who pays. He said, undue influence claims settled badly. There's no version where they say it was a misunderstanding. You'll be buying the accusation, not ending it. The 3rd of March was a scheduling conference, and it lasted 11 minutes, and it nearly broke me. They came in holding hands. My father had lost weight and gotten a haircut. My mother had her hair done and was wearing a cardigan I recognized, which I have no explanation for, and which unsettled me for weeks. Their attorney was a man named Nardone out of Warrensburg. At one point, the judge asked a routine question about availability, and my father started to answer, and my mother finished it. We're both retired now, so any date works, Your Honor. And the judge said, well, that's convenient, and there was a small laugh in the courtroom. A laugh. On the 3rd of March, there was a small, warm laugh in that room, and it was for them. I walked out into the hall, and Estelle was waiting by the vending machine, and she took one look at me and said, I know. They ran a campaign, and it was good, and I am not too proud to say that. In January, before I was even served, which I did not know until later, they posted a photograph of the 2 of them at a restaurant in Warrensburg with the caption, 32 years ago today, which was true. They married on the 18th of January, 1994. In February, they started attending a church in Sedalia together. Not their old church, a new one where nobody had known them in 2015. And in April, on what would have been my grandmother's 88th birthday, they posted a photograph of the 2 of them at her grave at Crown Hill with fresh flowers. That one nearly finished me. I sat in my car outside of Casey's and looked at a picture of my parents standing at Opal Pardue's headstone, and the flowers were nice, and my mother had her hand on the top of the stone. I had been out there the previous Sunday. I go out there most Sundays. Nobody has ever photographed me doing it because there has never been anybody with me. I wanted to answer it. All of it. I had a whole document drafted. Dates, the 11 visits visits, the 9 visits, the 19 returned letters. Estelle talked me out of it in about 4 sentences, standing in her kitchen, and I have thought about what she said probably once a week since. She said, "Andy, you'll lose that fight in this county." I said it was true, and she said, "It being true's got nothing to do with it. People around here would rather have a story where a family came back together than a story where 2 people came back for money. They'll pick the first one every time, and it's not because they're stupid. It's because most of them have somebody they're hoping comes back." Then she said, "Let the paper do it. Paper doesn't care what anybody would rather." She was right about the county. The woman at the pharmacy on Broadway who has filled my prescriptions for 6 years and who knew my grandmother said, "I hear your folks are back around. That's nice, isn't it?" A man at the co-op said to Estelle in March, "Is Lonnie's girl really taking them to court?" Taking them to court. That's the sentence that got around. They filed the petition. I did not file anything. I have never filed anything in my life. And by the second week of March, the version circulating in Pettis County was that Lonnie's girl was taking her parents to court over a farm. You cannot correct that. There is no mechanism. You can say the true thing to 11 people, and it will still be the other thing at the co-op. The worst one was in April, at a funeral, which is where everything in this county happens. A man from my grandmother's church died, and Estelle went and I drove her. And afterward, in the fellowship hall, a woman of about 70 who had known Opal for 50 years came over and took my hand in both of hers and said, "I'm just so glad your mom and dad are back in your life. Opal would have loved that." She meant it entirely. There was not one drop of anything in it. She was a kind woman being kind at a funeral, and I stood there holding a paper cup with my grandmother's name in her mouth 3 weeks before the depositions, with 2 letters in a boot box on a closet shelf that I could not mention to anybody. And I said, "Thank you." That's what I said. "Thank you." Estelle watched me do it from about 10 feet away and did not say a word about it on the drive home until we were past the Walmart. And then she said, "That was hard." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Won't always be," which is the closest thing to a promise anybody made me that whole year, and which turned out to be true, and which she had no way of knowing. I went through the shoebox properly for the first time on a Saturday at the end of March. Not because I was looking for anything, because Yancey had asked me for anything documenting the relationship, and I had been putting it off for 6 weeks because I could not face it. It's a Red Wing boot box, and I know exactly when I got it. The 4th of May, 2019, a Saturday, in her kitchen. I'd come out to help her get the storm windows down, and we'd finished, and I was washing my hands at the sink. She went into the back and came out with it and set it on the table and put both hands on the lid. She said, "Take this and keep it somewhere your aunt won't throw it out," which was a joke. Estelle has never thrown anything out in her life, and I laughed, and she did not laugh. I said, "What is it?" And she said, "Papers." I said, "Papers I need to do something with?" And my grandmother, who was 81 and had 2 years before dialysis and 5 before she died, said, "Papers you'll be glad of." Then she asked me if I wanted a sandwich. I have gone at that sentence from every angle for 2 years. Papers you'll be glad of. Not papers about the house. Not my will's in there. Not don't lose this. Glad of. Which means she had already imagined a day when I would be sitting somewhere holding them being glad, and that means she had imagined the day badly enough to prepare for it. And she never once said a word to me about who she thought was coming. She had 10 more years of Saturdays with me. She had 3 years of Tuesdays and Fridays in a car. She could have told me at any point in about 90 seconds. She didn't. She handed me a boot box and asked if I wanted a sandwich. And I put it on a closet shelf and did not open it for 6 years and 11 months, which is exactly the amount of time she'd have expected from me, because she knew me better than anybody has before or since. I put it on a closet shelf in 2019 and did not open it. 5 years and then 18 months more. I sat on the floor of my apartment on the 28th of March with it in front of me and the cat on the arm of the couch, and I opened it at about 11 in the morning, and I was still on that floor at 4. The top layer was what I expected. Insurance things. A land survey from 1974, her marriage certificate, a funeral program for my grandfather from 1988, then a rubber-banded stack, and I knew what it was by the shape before I got the band off. 61 certified mail receipts, green cards and white ones. Every single one I had ever sent, going back to October of 2016, which means my grandmother had been collecting them, which means she had been asking me for them, which means the reason I could never find the last one in my kitchen drawer is that I'd given it to her. She'd been building it too, both of them. My aunt at the post office counter in 2016 and my grandmother in a boot box, and neither of them told me, and I would put money on the two of them never having discussed it with each other. Underneath the receipts was a birthday card, returned with "Return to Sender," stamped across it, and my own handwriting on the envelope from when I was 11 years old. I do not know how she got that. I have never worked it out. It's from 2006, and it's addressed to my mother at an address on Grand, and it came back, and my grandmother had it, and I sat on my floor and held an envelope I addressed at 11, and made a sound I have not made before or since. The 2 letters were at the bottom, under a phone bill from 2019. Same letterhead. A firm in Sedalia that no longer exists. The attorney who drafted the trust retired in 2020. Both dated April 2016. One April 12th, one April 23rd. 11 days apart. They are responses. In April of 2016, when Opal Pardue set up that trust, her attorney sent a notice to her son and to her daughter-in-law. A routine thing, apparently, when an estate plan is being restructured and there are people who might otherwise expect to be named. And each of them wrote back. My father's is 4 lines. It says he does not wish to be named in his mother's estate plan and asks that he not be contacted further regarding the matter. My mother's is longer, a paragraph and a half. It says she and Lonnie are divorced as of 2015, that she has no claim and expects none, that she'd appreciate not being contacted about the family's business again, and she signs it Verlene Coburn, which is the name she was using in 2016. Both signed, both dated, both on the attorney's file letterhead with the firm's received stamp on them. I read them about 9 times sitting on that floor. And then I understood the thing that actually mattered, and it took me another 20 minutes to get there. They didn't know about each other's. Yancey understood it in about 11 seconds, which is what you pay a man 26 years for. I brought them in on the 30th of March in a manila envelope, and he read them and set them down and said, "Do you understand what you've got?" I said they proved my parents had declined. And he said, "That's the small half." He said, "2 people are prosecuting a joint case built on a shared account of the last 10 years. They have rehearsed it. They're good at it." He'd watched them in that courtroom same as I had, but that account has a hole in it, and the hole is April of 2016, and neither of them can see it because each one only knows their own half. "Your father thinks his mother cut everybody out," he said. "Your mother thinks your father cut her out." Those are 2 different stories about the same 11 days, and they have been living inside them separately for 10 years. Then he said the thing that made the whole spring survivable. "We are not going to file these." That was the hardest month of my life, and it was entirely because of a decision I agreed with. Yancey's reasoning was procedural, and it was correct. If we filed them or produced them informally, there'd be a fight about them, where they came from, whether they were complete, whether there were other letters. Their attorney would have 3 weeks to prepare his clients, but if they served a request for production and we responded to it, then the letters would go over as part of an ordinary indexed response, and Nardone would get them in a stack of 1,100 pages, and, critically, his clients would not necessarily see them before he did. "They'll be sitting in a box in his office," Yancey said, "and he'll find them. And then he has a very difficult conversation with 2 clients who have been lying to each other, not to him." I said, "What if they don't request anything?" And he said, "Andrea, they filed an undue influence claim. They will request everything." 7 weeks. I had to sit on those 2 letters for 7 weeks and go to work and build an OR board every morning and drive past a church my parents were now attending and let the county go on saying that Lonnie's girl was taking her folks to court. The board saved me, and the board also nearly cost me my job, which are both true. On a normal morning, I'm at that screen at 5:30 with coffee in 9 rooms and about 31 cases, and everything is a Tetris problem. Room 4's 10:30 gallbladder needs the same instrument tray as room 2's 9 o'clock. Dr. Bledsoe does not start before 8 and will not be told otherwise. Anesthesia's short a person on Thursdays. That is a completely absorbing problem, and for 4 to 6 hours a day, it left no room in my head for anything else, which is the only reason I made it to April. But at 2:15 in the afternoon, the board is built and the day is running, and there is nothing to hold, and that is when it would come. On the 20th of April, the day before my father's deposition, a case in room 6 ran 90 minutes long, and I had to bump a 2 o'clock and I did it wrong. I moved a patient who had been NPO since midnight to a 4:15 without checking whether her ride could stay and her ride could not stay, and a nurse manager named Guerrero came and found me about it. She was right. She was entirely right, and she was not even unkind about it. And I said something to her that I will not write down. I apologized 20 minutes later in the break room, and she said, "You want to tell me what's going on?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Okay." And then she said, "Take your Thursday," and put me down for a PTO day I had not asked for, which is how I was able to be in that conference room on the 21st without using a sick day to do it. I have never told her what any of it was about. She retired last year. I sent her a card. The request came on the 14th of April, and it was, as predicted, overbroad, the kind of request a lawyer writes when he's fishing. All documents and communications relating to Opal Pardue. Yancey smiled when he read it. Actually smiled. He said, "Well, all right. We produced 1,104 pages on the 16th. Every card, every receipt, every text message thread I had with my grandmother going back to 2018, the mileage log I'd kept for the dialysis trips because Estelle told me to, bank records showing I never took $1, the 2 letters at tabs 1088 and 1091 in date order exactly where they belong, indexed, Bates numbered, nothing highlighted, nothing flagged, no cover letter drawing attention to anything, and then 11 days of absolutely nothing. Those 11 days. I checked my email at 6:15 every morning. I was short with a nurse manager on the 20th over a room turnover and had to apologize. I did not sleep more than 5 hours a night. On the 27th, Yancey called me at 3:40 in the afternoon and said, "Nardone just asked whether we'd agree to take both depositions on the same day." I said, "Is that normal?" And he said, "It's normal when your clients want to be in the room together," he said. I declined. Yancey prepped me for 4 hours on the 18th, which is a Saturday, in his office with the heat off because the building's heat is on a timer. I was going to be deposed too. I'd assumed I'd be first, and I was wrong. Nardone had noticed mine for May, and it never happened because there was no case by May. The prep was not about the letters. He barely mentioned the letters. It was 4 hours of him asking me the 12 worst questions anybody could ask me, over and over until I stopped improving my answers. Did you tell your grandmother what to put in her trust? Did you drive her to that attorney's office? Did you ever discuss the farm with her? Isn't it true that you were the only person present at most of her medical appointments? yes. That last one is the one I kept losing, because the answer is yes. And every instinct I had was to explain, to say that nobody else offered, that I asked my father twice in 2021, that Estelle worked days. And Yancey stopped me the fourth time and said, Andrea, yes, I said, but it makes it sound like the truth, which is that you were the only one who showed up. He put his pen down. Every time you explain, you're asking them to like you. Nardone doesn't have to like you. He has to fail to catch you in something. Those are completely different projects, and you keep doing the first one. Then he said the thing I actually took into that room on the 21st, which was, you are not there to win. You are there to be boring, and to be exactly as boring on question 90 as you were on question 4. I never got deposed, but I sat in a chair on the 21st and the 22nd and watched two people who had not been prepped that way, and I understood what he'd been giving me. My father explained. Every single answer, he explained. And each explanation was reasonable and warm and slightly different from the last one, and by 90 minutes in there were 4 versions of April 2016 in the transcript before anybody showed him a piece of paper. Lonnie Pardue was deposed on the 21st of April at 9 in the morning in a conference room in Sedalia. I was there. I was entitled to be there, and Yancey asked me if I wanted to be, and I said yes, and I have never regretted anything less. For the first 90 minutes it was fine for him. He was good. He was warm and rueful, and he talked about how he'd let things drift with his mother, and he did not say one cruel word about me, which I had not expected and which was much worse than cruelty. Then Yancey took 2 pieces of paper out of a folder. He handed my father the April 12th letter first. He said, Mr. Pardue, do you recognize your signature? My father read it. He was quiet for a bit, and then he said yes, and he started to explain. He said something about how at the time he'd been going through a lot, and that his mother had made it clear where things stood, and that he'd been hurt, and that he'd written it in anger. And Yancey said, I understand, and let him finish. He let him finish completely. Then he slid the second one across, and I watched my father, who is 62 years old, read a letter he had never seen in his life. He got to the second paragraph. That's where his face changed. Not the signature at the bottom, not the name. The second paragraph, where my mother writes that she and Lonnie are divorced and that she has no claim and expects none. He read it twice. Then he looked up at Nardone, and Nardone did not look back at him. And my father said, can we take a break? 22 minutes. That's how long the break was. And it is the single loudest 22 minutes I have ever spent in a building. They were in a room down the hall, my father and his attorney, and Yancey and I sat in the conference room, and Yancey ate a granola bar and read something on his phone like it was any afternoon of his life. I said, what's happening down there? And he said, without looking up, Nardone is finding out that his clients have 2 different cases. When they came back, my father answered 11 more questions in a voice that had gone completely flat, and people always want a confrontation in this part, and there wasn't one, and the absence of one is the whole point. Yancey asked whether, when he wrote his letter in April of 2016, he'd been aware that a similar notice had gone to Verlaine Pardue. He said no. Whether he had ever discussed with her whether she'd been contacted by his mother's attorney. He said no. Whether, at any point between April of 2016 and February of 2026, he had told her there was nothing in his mother's estate for her to be named to. And my father sat there about 4 seconds and said, I don't recall the specific conversation, which is a lawyer's answer, and he is not a lawyer, and he had learned it in a hallway 22 minutes earlier. Then Yancey asked one more. He said, Mr. Pardue, did you file this petition believing your former wife had also been offered a place in your mother's estate plan and had also declined it? Nardone objected. My father answered anyway, the way people do. He said, I didn't think there was anything to decline, and he was not lying. That's the part I have had the hardest time with. My father genuinely believed for 10 years that his mother had shut the door on the entire family in April of 2016, because that is the only version he had, because he wrote 4 lines in anger and never asked one question afterward. He built a decade on a document he sent and never followed up on, and then he built a lawsuit on top of it. It was over by 12:40. He walked past me on the way out. He did not look at me. He has not spoken to me since the 21st of April, 2026. My mother was deposed the next morning at 9. She had not spoken to my father. Yancey had asked for and gotten an agreement on that, and I do not know whether it was honored, but everything about the next hour says it was. She came in bright. She was pleasant to the court reporter. She had a folder of her own with nothing in it that I could see. She was better than him for the first hour. She talked about my grandmother with real warmth, and I think it was genuine. My mother and Opal actually liked each other, which was one of the strange facts of my childhood. Yancey handed her the April 23rd letter. She recognized it immediately. She said, "That's mine," before he'd even asked. And she explained it, and her explanation was fluent, and it was that in 2016 she was newly divorced, that Lonnie had made clear the family's business was no longer hers, and that she had written it to make a point, and had never expected it to matter. Then Yancey slid my father's letter across. She picked it up. She did not go pale, and her hands did not shake. What happened is that she read it, all 4 lines, and then she read it again, and then she set it down on the table very carefully, squared it with her fingertips, and looked at nothing for about 6 seconds. And then my mother said, to the room, "He told me there was nothing to be named to." The court reporter typed it. Nardone said his client's name. And my mother sat there with her hands flat on a conference table and said, 11 days. He wrote his 11 days before I wrote mine. And then she said, "He let me write that." The petition was dismissed with prejudice on the 11th of June. The court assessed costs against the petitioners, $4,200 and change, which I understand has not been paid. There was no hearing. Nardone filed a motion to withdraw on the 8th of May, which is 17 days after my mother said what she said, and the dismissal followed a month later. I was not in a room for any of it. It ended in a docket entry. I read it on my phone at 11:40 in the morning, standing in a corridor on the second floor between the pre-op bay and the sterile core, with a badge on and a printout of the afternoon board in my other hand. Cause dismissed with prejudice. Costs taxed to petitioners. 11 words. I stood there for a second, and then a circulator came through the double doors and asked me whether room 3's add-on was still going at 1. And I said yes, and I went and did the rest of my day. That's the whole thing. 16 months from a man in a Nissan in a parking lot to 11 words on a phone, and in between it took a shoebox, 2 letters, 1,104 pages, and my mother sitting in a conference room finding out on a Wednesday morning what her ex-husband had done to her in April of 2016. I did not tell anybody at work. I went home at 5 and fed the cat and sat on the couch and did not turn the television on for about an hour. Then I called Estelle and said it was over, and she said, well, and then she said, you want to come out Sunday? I've got too much of that ham. The reunion did not survive the summer. I know that the way I know everything about them, which is secondhand. My father is back near Clinton, and my mother went back to Springfield in July. They were married for 8 months. Not in fact, they never remarried. That was Nardone's idea, and it never happened. They took out a license in December and never used it. 8 months of a photograph in a church and a hand held up a center aisle. I kept the farmhouse. Sutter's beans went in the 22 acres in May. I gave Estelle the brokerage account, all of it. It took 3 weeks, and it was the worst argument the two of us have ever had. She would not take it. She said it wasn't hers, that her mother had decided that she didn't need it. She is 61 with a bad back, a plant pension, and no savings, and she said she didn't need it. I went out there 4 times. The 4th time was a Tuesday in July, and I sat down at her kitchen table and did not bring it up at all for about 40 minutes. And then I said, how much did I eat, do you think? She said, what? From 11 to 19, 8 years. I had actually done this on a legal pad, which tells you everything about who raised me. Say $6 a day, which is low. That's about $17,000 of groceries. Then there's the car insurance you carried me on. Then the braces. And Estelle said, Andrea. And I said, you did that on a connector plant wage while your brother lived 4 miles away. And my aunt, who has not cried in front of me since her mother's funeral and did not cry at her mother's funeral, put both hands flat on that table and cried. Then she said, I never once thought about it like that, which is true, and which is the entire difference between her and everybody else in this story. It never occurred to Estelle Pardue that a room and 8 years of dinners was a thing anybody could owe her for. That's not humility. It's a kind of blindness, and it is the good kind, and there are about 4 people in 100 who have it. Yancey drew it up the following week. $121,000, outright, no strings, and I made him put in language that it was a gift and not compensation, because I did not want a single word in that document that could be read as her having earned it. She bought a new furnace and put the rest in a CD and has not touched it. Nobody sued over that account. Nobody ever mentioned it. My parents came for a farmhouse and 22 acres, which is what people around here understand as an inheritance, and never once asked about the number that was actually larger. My mother called me in August, once, alone. I was in my car in the hospital lot at about 6 in the evening, and I saw the name, and I let it go to voicemail, and then I called her back 4 minutes later, which I have never fully explained to myself. She did not apologize. I want to be accurate about that, because it would be a nicer story if she had. What she said was, I didn't know about his letter, and I said, I know. And she said, I'm not saying that makes it, and then she stopped, and there was about 10 seconds of a phone line, and then she said, you drove her all that time. Not a question, just that. I said yes. She said, okay, and then she said she'd let me go, and she did. That's the entire conversation, 40 seconds. It is more than I got in the 9 years before it, and I have decided, for my own sake, to let it be a thing that happened rather than the start of something, because I have been on the other end of the start of something before. I still go out on Sundays. Crown Hill, then the farmhouse to run the water. In September, I put the boot box back on the closet shelf, which is where it is now, with the 61 receipts and a returned birthday card in an 11-year-old's handwriting and 2 letters from April of 2016. I've thought a lot about what my grandmother knew, whether she kept those letters because she saw this coming or because she was a woman who kept things. I've decided it doesn't matter, and that deciding that is the only real inheritance in the whole business. Sutter cut those 22 acres in October, and I drove out to watch, and stayed in the car with the engine off and the window down for about half an hour, and did not get out because there was nothing out there to do.